Hello and welcome to Samuel's Fortress. I'm your host Kirill, and today we're going to be discussing Macedonia under Ottoman occupation. Before we get to the Ottomans, however, I do want to give you a very brief kind of overview of what's going on in Macedonia from the fall of the First Bulgarian Empire to the arrival of the Ottomans. So in the last video we discussed Tsar Samuel and his defeat at the hands of the Byzantine Emperor Basil II and the fall of the First Bulgarian Empire to Basil and the Byzantines. Now that occurred, if you recall, in the year 1018. So in 1018, the Byzantines regained administrative control over Macedonia and the other Balkan territories that were under the First Bulgarian Empire. And that Byzantine administration pretty much lasts from that beginning period, from the beginning of the 11th century, pretty much towards the end of the 12th century. What occurs in the end of the 12th century is the rise of a second Bulgarian Empire. This new Bulgarian Empire is pretty much based off Tarnovo. We're not really going to get into the second Bulgarian Empire too much. Maybe I'll touch on that later on. Doesn't really have too much of an effect on the Macedonian question as such, so I'm not going to really get into that right now. But nevertheless, there is a second Bulgarian Empire, and it manages to expand from Tarnovo, which is in northern kind of modern Bulgaria, and does retake the lost territories of Macedonia. However, that doesn't last terribly long. It's not as long as the First Bulgarian Empire. And around the late 13th century, Macedonia again falls under Byzantine control and remains under Byzantine control until the early parts of the 14th century. In the early to mid 14th century, we see an expansion of the Serbian state under the Kingdom of Serbia, later the Empire of Serbia, into the Macedonian territories. Now, this Serbian control over Macedonia doesn't last very long at all. It pretty much lasts during the middle of the 14th century for about 30 to 40 years. The middle-aged Serbian Empire doesn't really have much of an effect on the Macedonian question. The Serbs' involvement in the Macedonian question is much more pronounced in the 19th and 20th centuries, but that's something we'll discuss in subsequent videos. But nevertheless, the Serbians do manage to control Macedonia in this period in the middle 14th century. However, towards the end of the 14th century, we see the arrival of the Ottomans. The Ottomans are basically the Anatolian Turks who expand from Anatolia. They go east to conquer the Near East, the Middle East, and into the Balkans. There's some famous battles, such as the Battle of Kosovo, that occurs between the Serbs and the Ottomans, but pretty much by the end of the 14th century, Macedonia is under Ottoman control, and the majority of the Balkans is under Ottoman control at this time. And as most people know, in 1453, the Byzantine capital of Constantinople itself falls to the Ottomans and becomes Istanbul as it remains today. So who are the Ottomans? And what is the Ottoman Empire? I'm not going to get too much into the history of the Ottoman Empire, but R.J. Crampton here, I've referenced this book before, A Concise History of Bulgaria. R.J. Crampton is a history professor at the University of Oxford in England. He gives a pretty good kind of brief summary of the Ottoman Empire. Now quoting him, "The Ottoman Empire was a theocracy. Its head of state, the Sultan, was also Caliph, or the representative of God on earth and the supreme Muslim religious authority. He was Pope as well as Emperor. Non-Muslims were discriminated against in a variety of ways. They paid higher taxes than Muslims. Christian churches could not be as high as mosques. Christians could not wear the sacred color green. No attempt could be made to proselytize amongst Muslims. At times, Christians had to dismount from their horses when a Muslim passed the other way. Christians could not carry arms. They could not become tanners because that was Muhammad's trade. And most importantly, Muslim law was superior to any other." So we can see this is pretty much an Islamic caliphate. The Ottomans are obviously Muslims, and everyone, primarily Christians in the Balkans at least, were subjugated, as you can see here, under this Islamic authority. Now, what occurs here, the way the Ottomans administer their state is they pretty much dissolve these ethnic identities that exist prior to their arrival. So Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek, all these different ethnicities, they kind of get wiped out. I mean, they're still there. Obviously, the people understand they're still Serbian, Greek, Bulgarian, and so forth. But as far as administration is concerned, ethnic identities are done away with, and the Ottomans administer the state through these religious units called millets. So a millet is basically a form of, again, religious administration that takes the place of these ethnic identities. So if you were, regardless if you were Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek, you are now simply classified as a Christian. So there's basically four millets, at least at the beginning. There's different administrative reforms that go on through the centuries, through the Ottoman Empire, but at least at the beginning there was four main millets. You had the Muslim millet, the Jewish, Armenian Christian, and Orthodox Christian millets. And again here, I'll just quote briefly from Professor Crampton on this. He states, quote, "Each separate religious group or millet was allowed to regulate its internal affairs. This meant not merely the organization of their own religious life, but also such issues as education, property law, and family law. The head of a millet was the head of a religious group in question, and he represented that community before the Sultan and the Sublime Porte or Ottoman government. The head of a millet was also held responsible by the latter for the good behavior of his flock, who would be expected to pay their taxes and, where necessary or appropriate, provide troops for the army or navy." He goes on, quote, "Although the non-Muslim millets enjoyed internal self-administration, they were subordinate to the Muslims. Any legal dispute involving a Muslim had to be tried by Muslim law." So we see here that there's these millets, these religious administrative groups, each representing, each respective religion. But nevertheless, the Muslims clearly are on top. This is an Islamic theocracy. So again, you have the Muslims, and beneath them, Jews, Armenian Christians, and Orthodox Christians. Now, what's important to note here, it's not as simple as Muslims are on top, everyone else is beneath them. The millets themselves kind of form a hierarchy, or a totem pole, if you will. So certain religious groups, certain non-Muslim religious groups do enjoy certain privileges as opposed to others. So to give you an example, obviously you have the Muslims on top. Beneath them, it's typically understood that the Jewish millet was kind of second to the Muslims, if you will. The Jewish millet was privileged in certain ways. The Jews were given positions as far as international trade. They kind of formed the backbone of the merchant class. Certain port cities, which were important for international trade, such as Thessaloniki, were almost exclusively Jewish. They essentially ran the merchant sector. Even though the Jews were somewhere around 3% of, I think, the total population of the Ottoman Empire, they were vastly overrepresented in these areas of trade and so forth. So you can see they enjoy certain privileges. Beneath the Jews were the Greek Orthodox Christians. The Greeks were given certain privileges, even though they were Orthodox, the same way the Bulgarians and the Serbs were, for example. The Greeks were given a little bit higher priority over the Slavic Christians due to the fact that the Greeks were the former administrators of the Byzantine Empire, and the Ottomans kind of used them to help administer the Ottoman state. We'll get into that a little bit later on. But they're kind of, if you will, a little bit lower than the Jews on the totem pole. And then at the very bottom, you have the Slavic Christians, the Serbs, Bulgarians, and so forth. Now, what does it mean to be at the bottom of the totem pole, if you will? Well, it means you have to pay the jizya. What is the jizya? The jizya is the tax levied against non-Muslims. So a lot of people, I'll see, they'll use the term tax to describe the jizya without really getting specific into what this tax entitled. So a lot of people will hear this and they think, oh, non-Muslims simply have to pay, an extra monetary amount For example, let's say, Muslims have to pay 10% of, their income or whatever, their wealth to taxes. Non-Muslims have to pay 20% or 30%. They have a higher rate of taxation. Although that's part of it, there's certainly a fiscal and monetary uh, aspect to the jizya, to this tax on non-Muslims. The jizya is more than just a financial burden. The point of the jizya under Islamic law is actually a form of humiliation. It's a way to assert dominance by the Muslims over non-Muslims, with eventually the goal of making this this burden so great that the non-Muslims simply convert to Islam. So, for example, the jizya could be paid, like I said, in numerous ways other than financially. A Christian could simply be brought to the town square and beaten, have his beard pulled out as a form of humiliation. This could satisfy the jizya. If you are a Christian father, for example, your daughter could be taken from you and sold to the Muslims as a sex slave. This could be a form of satisfying the jizya. One of the more well-known aspects would be that young Christian boys, usually between kind of the ages of 7 to 14, would be taken from their families and placed in the Janissary Corps. The Janissaries were a kind of an elite unit within the Ottoman military that were comprised of these Christian boys that were stolen from their families. They were trained as kind of these elite Islamic warriors. They converted to Islam. They were trained, again, by the Ottomans to be their kind of special forces, if you will. So these are various ways that the jizya could be satisfied. So again, this is kind of not very pleasant, as you can imagine, for the Christian population that finds itself under this Ottoman rule. Now, many Christians simply choose to convert to Islam to avoid this punishment. Albanians, for example, who were essentially Christian prior to the arrival of the Ottomans, convert in great numbers to Islam. The majority of Albanians today are Muslims, although there are Christian, Catholic, and Orthodox Albanians today. Again, the majority are Muslims. The Bulgarian Christians also convert, some of them, to Islam. They're known as the Pomaks. In Macedonia, we call them the Torbesh. These are essentially they're ethnic Slavs who simply convert to Islam. The Serbs, a lot of the Serbs actually end up fleeing to Austria-Hungary. Serbia is quite close if you kind of look at a map of where Serbia is as opposed to where the Austro-Hungarian Empire was. A lot of them just fled north and escaped the Ottoman Empire altogether, became subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A lot of the places, like in Macedonia and Bulgaria, who couldn't really flee the Ottoman Empire itself, a lot of the Christians there would just leave the towns, the major cities, and kind of escape up into the mountains and create these kind of small villages that were, again, up in the mountains, kind of distant, these distant places where they could avoid this kind of heavy-handed Ottoman administration. And R.J. Crampton here, he also has a couple paragraphs on this as well. He writes, quote, "Although many Bulgarian guilds flourished under Ottoman rule, the conquest had been a cultural as well as a political disaster for the Bulgarian nation. Not only did the state disappear and the church fall subject to the dominion of Constantinople, the Bulgarian language and literature seemed also to die. Bulgarian had once ranked with Greek, Latin, and Arabic as the major tongues of the civilized European world, and it had produced a flourishing literature, secular as well as sacred works." He goes on, "Yet the language remained alive during the years of the Ottoman rule, and eventually its literature was to be reborn. The language survived primarily because most Bulgarians lived in their small, isolated, and usually ethnically homogeneous villages. In such communities, there was no need to adopt Greek for everyday economic or commercial transactions, nor to use Turkish when dealing with government officials. The villages therefore preserved the Bulgarian language and with it Bulgarian names, Bulgarian folk tales and legends, Bulgarian forms of family organization, and Bulgarian festivals and holidays. So you can see here that by moving away from the major population centers and kind of hiding up in the mountains in these distant villages, the Christian population of Bulgaria managed to preserve its cultural, linguistic heritage, if you will. So that was briefly in there. R.J. Crampton also mentioned the destruction of the Bulgarian church. Now, what's interesting is, for a long period of time, the Ottomans allowed for the Bulgarian church and the Serbian church to remain. Basically, the Bulgarian church being based out of Ohrid, in the Ohrid Archbishopric, and the Serbian church out of Peć. What happens is, in the late 18th century, this kind of changes, and the Ottomans kind of create a Ponzi scheme out of the church system. So what I mean by this is, in 1766, the Serbian church in Peć, and the following year in 1767, the Bulgarian church in Ohrid are dissolved, and these territories, these jurisdictions that were Serbian and Bulgarian previously, are now placed directly under the rule of the Patriarch in Constantinople. Now, what's going on in Constantinople here is the Ottomans are essentially buying and selling church offices. Again, they're kind of running a Ponzi scheme, a pyramid scheme in a way. So what they're doing is they're kind of pushing out the real religious kind of church leaders, and they're allowing these wealthy Greek businessmen to purchase the offices. So essentially these bishops, metropolitans, the patriarch himself will not be religious figures. I mean, they will be religious figures in name. Nominally, they'll be religious figures, but essentially these are businessmen who purchase these positions for their financial benefit. So I'll quote here again from Professor Crampton. He writes here, quote, "By the end of the century, only the wealthiest Greek families could afford high office. Most of these Greeks were residents in the Phanar district of Constantinople. Then, much in contrast to the present day, one of the wealthiest districts in the city. These Phanar Greeks thus came to dominate the Patriarchate. Because ecclesiastical appointments in the provinces also required financial sweeteners, the policy whereby wealthy locals, again usually Greeks, came to dominate the church was repeated. Each cleric expected to recoup his expenses from those below him, and this process percolated down until the burden eventually fell upon the ordinary villager and town dweller. So onerous were church taxes in the 17th century that Orthodox bishops frequently used Ottoman troops to help collect them." So what's going on here is these traditional Slavic Orthodox archbishoprics, patriarchates, are dissolved. They're put under the control of the Greek Phanar in Constantinople, under the Patriarchate in Constantinople, and they are exploited for tax purposes. Basically, a Greek businessman would pay the Ottomans to give him a church title such as bishop, and then in order to recoup the money he paid for the seat, he would collect taxes from the local villagers, townspeople, and he would kind of suck up through this new position as a church administrator, as a bishop or a metropolitan. He would collect these taxes from the local peoples. So this was kind of a Ponzi scheme run by the Ottomans with the help of these Greek businessmen. So you can see here, without kind of rambling too much, that the average Orthodox Christian Slav, regardless of specific ethnicity, was heavily exploited during this Ottoman period. And this Ottoman period will last until the 19th, 20th century, as the Ottoman Empire starts collapsing and these the Greeks, Bulgarians, Serbs, and so forth start reclaiming their territories that existed prior to the Ottoman rule. But that will be where we'll pick up in the next series of videos. This video will be the last series in the ancient and medieval Macedonian history. This is the 10th and final video of this series. We'll be picking up next time with the second series of 10 videos starting in the 19th century into the 21st century. There's going to be a bit of a break between this video and the start of the next series. I'm going to take a little bit of a break from the channel for the Christmas season. I will be back after Old Calendar Orthodox Christmas, probably in mid-January of next year. So until then, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.